I, I don't know how the American people can stand by and watch such a thing take place. We have people out here, we have all these people, women, children, tiny babies. These men came in here and they started firing on us. The bullets came through the walls and people were killed, people were injured. And this is America.
I mean, I thought this was the country of, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, whatever, and just human decency. It just doesn't seem to exist.
Waco still resonates within the anti-government community as an event that demonstrates the federal government does not protect its citizens, that it is willing to violate their civil rights and take away their guns.
The Waco siege became a symbol of discord over a range of issues, such as violence and gun ownership, trust in government and state authority, and religious persecution. The catastrophe sparked a flood of books, articles, news stories, and television segments, becoming an integral part of public discourse. Waco became a vital topic in the country, and to this day, Americans experience its consequences. The most significant and most frightening consequence of the Waco tragedy was the deepened division among the American population, a divide that, unfortunately, has not been overcome to this day. A country and a people that once stood united were split into two warring camps, and this painful wound on the body of America has not healed to this present time. Representatives of the anti-cult movement deliberately shaped two extreme viewpoints on the Waco tragedy. As a result, descriptions of the Waco events in various media are often so contradictory that it looks as if groups of people who oppose each other describe completely different occurrences.
NBC television aired the government's official propaganda as a movie, showing Branch Davidians at all the windows with guns waiting for the ATF to arrive.
The anti-cultists are largely responsible for the enduring impact of the Waco tragedy on America, which goes on to this day. They have used the Waco siege to create new information terror campaigns aimed at destabilizing authority and influencing the political situation in the country, significantly contributing to polarization of U.S. politics. It is because of the anti-cultists that the fire in Waco was ignited, and it is because of them that it continues to burn to this day. Back then, anti-cultists laid the foundation for a future civil war. They artificially created a basis for confrontation between supporters of the two dominant political parties in the United States and provoked the emergence of not only discontent with the authorities, but also extremely radical sentiments in society. The anti-cultists still use these fruits of their own activities, continuing to incite hatred in society and create conditions for a future confrontation between citizens of one country, between us, Americans. The anti-cultists arranged the terrorist attack in Waco with the help of their main accomplice, the media and dishonest journalists under their control. And if back in 1993, Rick Ross and his companions labeled a community of about 100 people as a cult, which resulted in their murder and a chain of terrible consequences for the United States, the other anti-cultist and deprogrammer, Stephen Hessen, has gone even further. At the current stage, he has already labeled tens of millions of Americans as cult followers. Such rhetoric that dehumanizes a part of the American nation creates prerequisites for international conflict and violence against labeled citizens. It is also noteworthy that this rhetoric amazingly repeats the narratives of anti-cultists in Russia, who label the people of America as one big cult. Yet, before, they manipulated only their own people in this way, setting up Russians against Americans, whereas now, the agent of the anti-cult gang in the USA, who's been conducting his destructive activities here for many years, repeats the same actions, but this time from inside America, setting Americans against Americans. Moreover, Stephen Hessen has already gone further, saying that the entire USA needs to be deprogrammed.
And the bottom line is all of America needs deprogramming because we've all been negatively influenced by Donald Trump.
What is meant by deprogramming the entire country? Remembering what happened in Waco, Texas, and how their deprogramming ended, just imagine in what way the anti-cultists plan to expand their methods to the entire United States of America. The main question is, With whose hands do they want to implement their plans this time? After all, as anti-cultists understand it, deprogramming implies the use of violent methods to force people to renounce their beliefs. Isn't this the main motive and driving force of a civil war, to force one part of the population to give up their views and to submit to the will of another part of the population, thus labeling a part of Americans as adherents of the cult of Trump and calling for deprogramming? Hessen straightforwardly urges Americans to use force against other Americans. The most terrible thing is these are not just words and not mere appeals, but hidden destructive imprints that are embedded in those words and have repeatedly caused deaths of a huge number of people. And believing that they won't work this time is foolhardy at the very least. Recall German citizens who assisted Nazis, released gas and poisoned people, being fully confident that they were doing the right thing by ridding their nation of the Jewish threat. Those were actually the same people as you. And to this moment, no one has found an answer to the question of what turned them into monsters. Or putting it more correctly, who made them that? Yet, now you know the answer. Just think about it. Right now, anti-cultists are forcing us Americans, a nation that defeated Nazism, to use Nazi methods for destroying each other. They already successfully tested this scenario in Waco, when they carried out a large-scale operation involving the country's mainstream media, which resulted in the genocide of honest, peaceful, and decent Americans committed by the authorities and law enforcement agencies. How can you explain a situation where American law enforcement agencies tasked with protecting their people arrived for a routine search and ended up launching a full-scale military operation using military equipment against ordinary citizens of their country, which resulted in the deaths of almost 100 people? Indeed, from the perspective of common sense, a military raid that cost the U.S. government millions of dollars a day and was carried out against a group of American civilians that mostly included children, women, and elderly people looked like a disastrous misunderstanding. Why did the representatives of ATF and FBI accept the false, ungrounded information provided by anti-cultists as facts? Why did they rely solely on their pseudo-expert opinion at a time when the FBI had materials indicating that those people were incompetent in such matters? Moreover, FBI agents knew perfectly well that Rick Ross had personal hatred towards all kinds of new religious movements and an undisguised desire to urge law enforcement agencies in their attempt to destroy the Davidian group. In other words, federal agents had all the information they needed to understand that relying on anti-cultists in the matters of new religious movements was the same as believing that the Ku Klux Klan would remain impartial in assessing racial minorities. Yet, why did the agents trust the anti-cultists and implicitly follow their recommendations? Because representatives of intelligence services, law enforcement agencies, and the government were manipulated by anti-cultists who pushed for a violent crackdown on their stigmatized victims. In essence, officials were programmed for such actions. Let me draw your attention to another crucial point. The Waco tragedy occurred in 1993, the same year when the central ideological hub of anti-cult terrorists was established. Its leader was trained at a Russian Orthodox Christian educational institution in the United States. This means that even at that time, there were already breeding grounds for global anti-cultism of the Russian origin in the US, and they had enough influence to carry out such terror attacks. But that's not all. I delved into such detail about those events so that you can fully understand how representatives of anti-cultism operate and what the consequences of their actions are. The thing is that during the Waco siege, the FBI consulted with another cult fighter, Igor Smirnov, a Russian scientist and inventor of mind control weapons.
Igor Viktorovich Smirnov was a Russian scientist best known for his role in Soviet-era mind control research and the poorly explored field of human behavior study he called psychoecology. His maternal grandfather, Smirnov Ornaldo, was a renowned hypnotist. Igor Smirnov was the son of a high-ranking Soviet officer, Viktor Abakumov, head of SMERSH from 1943 to 1946, and Minister of State Security, MGB, from 1946 to 1951 under Joseph Stalin. At one time, Smirnov's father initiated an Operation North on mass relocation of supporters of Jehovah's Witnesses organization, as well as representatives of other religious associations and their families to Siberia. Despite his scientific activity, Igor Smirnov, just like his father, had anti-cult views, as he wrote in his book Psychoecology. Thus, in describing various religious groups, he solely used anti-cultist language and the label sect. He also adhered to the same pseudoscientific theory about the use of brainwashing techniques by leaders of new religious movements, which was actively promoted by Steve Hassan and Rick Ross. This was at a time when Smirnov was personally involved in the development of such technologies. Most of Igor Smirnov's research focused on remote influence on another person's consciousness and programming one's psyche and behavior. Application of psychotronic weapons developed by Smirnov included the potential to affect large groups of people for various purposes. For example, to incite mass aggression in a crowd, or, conversely, to calm public unrest. The majority of the experiments he conducted remain classified to this day. Smirnov wrote, "Psychotechnologies are the culmination of everything humanity has engaged in thus far. They are much more serious than the atomic bomb and space flights. Right now, we have only created a stone axe. Although using it, we can already perform surgical operations. We have obtained instrumental ways to access the subconsciousness and correct certain areas. Everything else is just specific applications." Smirnov also worked on uncovering hidden information in the subconscious, representing the true motivations behind a person's actions and intentions. He developed a method for identifying individuals potentially inclined to commit acts of terrorism. The question remains whether the goal of this development was to prevent terrorist acts, or to find individuals who could easily be turned into new terrorists if desired. Regardless, this method formed the basis of security systems designed for airports to identify terrorists before they attack. Today, this technology is used in various countries, including the United States.
Igor Smirnov worked on concepts such as psychocorrection, a term he used to describe application of subliminal messages to alter a subject's will, or even to modify their personality without their knowledge. Federal agents intended to use Smirnov's techniques to resolve the situation in Waco.
Two Russian psychologists have been brought in from Moscow to demonstrate a technique for analyzing the human mind and then influencing it. The concept is that with an understanding of an individual's mind, key words transmitted in music or white noise will force that person to obey. The FBI examined the system to use against David Koresh at Waco in Texas.
Thus, the FBI Counterterrorism Center experts secretly met with Smirnov in the United States. He proposed a plan. During negotiations, they should transmit messages from relatives of the Davidians, encrypted in a certain way that would bypass critical perception and be instilled directly into the subconsciousness of recipients, compelling them to follow these commands. In this case, the commands would be to leave the building and return to their families. For the leader of the Davidians, David Koresh, a special voice was planned to be used, allegedly the voice of God, that would be played by an actor and urge Koresh to surrender voluntarily. However, when agents asked what would happen if the subliminal signals did not work as intended, Smirnov replied that Koresh's followers might slit each other's throats, committing acts of fatal violence. According to the official version, the FBI declined Igor Smirnov's services after this kind of response. But that's the official version. Now, let's piece together the facts.